The whistle of the wind along the broken catenary wires sang a mournful aria over the valley long before the first breath of dawn. Between rows of half-submerged maize fields, the abandoned branch line that once stitched Milan to the Alpine passes glimmered faintly with hoarfrost, its rails black under a moon that had learned to hide behind curtains of radioactive dust. In the far distance, where the silhouette of what remained of Turin struggled against the night, an occasional thud, dull, resigned, rumbled through the chill. Italy had become a country of sudden silences punctuated by violence, a staccato heartbeat for a continent in rigor mortis. They called this winter the year of hollow bellies. Wheat from the east no longer reached Italy. The Baltic lanes were ash, and the Mediterranean was patrolled by drone corvettes bearing the double-headed eagle of the Russian Federation. Official broadcasts assured citizens that humanitarian corridors would open soon. In practice, soon became a synonym for never, and humanitarian was pronounced only by foreign influencers seeking clicks from the safety of Ohio. Long before calamity claimed the continent, an aging signalman named Alessandro Ferretti had watched the tides of history wash over the steel lines he tended. He was born in 1967, in a century that still believed itself too rational for miracles. By the time he turned 58, his joints hurt in the damp, but his ears remained sharp enough to register the pure tone of a well-oiled wheel voicing its satisfaction against the rail. That music had nourished him through 2 recessions, 1 pandemic, and the slow uncoupling of Europe from its certainties. The war began in February 2022, thousands of kilometers away, on the black soil of eastern Ukraine. Alessandro, still married then, watched the footage on a kitchen tablet while steam curled from his mocha pot. The experts promised it would be over by Easter. Kiev would fall, they said, or Moscow would fall, or perhaps nothing would fall at all because 21st century invasions were impossible inside a globalized economy. In those early days, one could still believe in reason. What followed instead was a slow grind, a trench at Avdiivka, a drone swarm over Kakhovka Reservoir, a year, then 2, then 3 of artillery thunder wearing down flesh and hope in equal measure. NATO, cautious and fragmented, shipped palletized shells and high-mobility launchers by night. Civilians donated homemade thermal scopes and knitted camouflage nets. Alessandro's nephew joined a volunteer brigade, leaving behind a voice message thick with gratitude and fear. The old rail worker could only reply with emojis and silence, for words had lost their ability to comfort. The winter of 2024 dragged into a spring of elections. That November, Americans returned Donald J. Trump to the White House on a platform of peace through strength and America First redux, slogans familiar as nostalgia and as potent. His inaugural address in January 2025 drew cheers when he vowed to end forever entanglements and to bring smart peace to Eastern Europe. Within 6 months, Kiev found itself alone. J.D. Vance, vice president, convert to populism and frugal Midwestern myth, promised the era of strategic charity was over. Marco Rubio, elevated to Secretary of State, flew shuttle diplomacy between Minsk and Ankara, praising constructive ambiguity. Elon Musk, now special envoy for reconstruction technologies, posed beside grain silos in Belarus and promised a constellation of satellites so bright that war would wither beneath its light. Alessandro read the headlines on a cracked phone, then slipped it back into his pocket. No signal reached the valley that week. When the armistice papers were finally drafted, facilitated by American consultants and notarized in Trump Tower, Kiev, Ukraine relinquished swaths of land for the promise of tariff exemptions in future energy trades. It is history, Trump tweeted from Mar-a-Lago, his words auto-translated into 10 languages by the last functioning neural aggregator. The art of the deal wins again. For a fragile moment, Europe exhaled. Ministers celebrated their reprieve. Defense budgets were quietly trimmed, investment funds shifted to renewable megaprojects meant to wean the continent off Russian gas that, ironically, still flowed through renamed pipelines. Alessandro's depot, once threatened with closure, received a modest grant for heritage preservation. He spent the money planting mulberries near the tracks. He was weeding around those saplings when the first low-yield tactical devices went off in 2045. No one admitted to launching them. Images of orange pillars rising over fern-green farmland lit up the mesh week, the fragmentary successor to the internet, a brittle overlay of local networks patched together by open-source optimists. Moscow blamed rogue nationalists in Warsaw. Washington condemned destabilizing acts but declined kinetic response. Brussels issued a statement that vanished into irrelevance when the second salvo cratered the North Sea cables. By Christmas, Russian armored columns reinforced by autonomous gun platforms and legions of stripped-down BMP drones rolled past the Rhine. Western armies, hollowed by years of budgetary anemia, retreated in irregular clusters. The old EU flag was lowered in Strasbourg, a new banner stitched with Orthodox crosses and industrial cogs fluttered in its place. It was in those bleak months that Alessandro's line, the forgotten ribbon between Alessandria and the Swiss frontier, became both prison and promise. The occupying commandant headquartered in Genoa saw no strategic value in a spur that meandered through fog and rice paddies, especially when satellite oversight was stretched thin across the conquered continent. That oversight flaw became Alessandro's aperture of hope. He had lost his wife to illness the year the blockade began, medicine had grown scarce, and power outages rendered dialysis centers lethal. Grief hollowed him, but routine held him upright. Every dawn he cycled to the depot, brewed coffee on a portable stove, and inspected the rust bleeding from the rail joints. Habit turned to mission. The afternoon, a band of hungry teenagers begged him for passage north. The mountains still breathe, they whispered. Swiss air defenses kept one corridor open. The story was probably rumor, but rumor was a seed. Alessandro resolved to water it. He opened the old maintenance shed and let the boys sleep among wrenches, oily blankets, and calendars faded to sepia. He showed them how to heft a sledge and drive spikes, how to gauge the gauge by feel, how to listen for hairline fractures. More youths arrived, some from as far as Bologna, talkative, sunburned, and determined not to starve in silence. They called him Nonno Ferro, Grandpa Iron, a name that tightened the ache in his chest yet warmed him against the February chill. Restoring a railway under occupation demanded discretion and audacity in equal measure. Alessandro rationed torch cuts to nights of heavy cloud cover. Telegraph poles were repurposed as watchtowers. Salvaged solar panels from bankrupt agritech farms powered angle grinders whose whine carried just far enough to trouble sleeping crows. Word spread through bartered whispers, a train was being reborn. The locomotive they chose was a sullen hulk, an ETR 233 left to oxidize under blackberry vines since 2030. Alessandro loved its lines, streamlined yet pragmatic, an echo of the futurist dreams Italy once mass-produced. Its traction motors were shot, its ceramic insulation flaked like old pastry. No matter. Panels could be cannibalized from derelict trams, bearings could be forged in artisanal kilns. Code for the vintage control firmware lay archived on the personal server of a retired hobbyist near Parma who traded it for a single bottle of homemade grappa. Hope, however, possessed a scent, the ozone of welding rods, the tang of locomotive grease, and soon Russian counterintelligence caught the whiff. Patrol drones began circling the valley at dusk. Propaganda broadcasts framed the rebels as terrorists threatening the stability of Pan-Eurasian peace. Alessandro's face appeared on wanted posters beside stylized line art of saboteurs. A bounty equal to 3 months' ration credits was offered for information leading to his arrest. He joked that he had never been worth so much alive. Still, they worked. A clandestine mile of track became 10, then 24, tracing a crooked lattice that skirted checkpoints and villages emptied by forced relocation. The resistance, calling themselves the machinists, divided into coteries, the ballast crew, the signal circle, the steam queens. Women from Genoa repurposed sewing cooperatives into foundries for seat upholstery. They sewed maps into the fabric so, if captured, every refugee would carry the route inked beneath their ribs. A Jesuit priest blessed the rails with contraband holy water, praying not for victory but for momentum. On the night of April 30th, 2046, an ash moon watched over the valley as Alessandro climbed into the driver's seat. He rested his hands on the throttle and felt the ancient current pulse through copper he himself had soldered. It was a test run, only 7 kilometers, but every heartbeat of wheel on rail echoed across the silent fields like thunder promising rain. At kilometer 4, the specter of doubt appeared in the form of a Russian recon jeep idling by a grade crossing. 2 soldiers, silhouettes against a searchlight bloom, gazed in disbelief as the locomotive slid past at 20 kilometers per hour. They reached for radios, static replied. The machinists had jammed the band with a continuous loop of Verdi's Dies Irae. Alessandro crossed the checkpoint before the first round cracked against the side panel. Sparks leapt, paint peeled, yet the engine held. When he rolled back into the shed at dawn, children who had stayed awake all night clung to his legs, their cheeks wet with relief. He He could not hear their cheers over the pounding of his own blood, but he saw their mouths form the word Viaggio, journey, and he smiled through tears he pretended were sweat. He slept 2 hours on a bed of burlap, dreaming of open tunnels and clear horizons. At noon a message arrived via a strip of punch tape fed through a teleprinter rescued from a museum, inspection coming. Midnight. Hide. The hunters were closing in. That afternoon the valley trembled under the passage of heavy armor. T-90 tanks modified with reactive ceramic skirts lumbered onto village roads too narrow for such monstrous intent. Rotary-wing drones hovered like steel hornets, cameras irised wide, searching for the heat signature of welders' torches. Alessandro ordered every burner dismantled, every anvil buried beneath sacks of rice husk, every rail cart cloaked in tarps smeared with sheep dung to confound infrared scans. The children hid in wine cellars, practicing silence as though it were a sacrament. The sun set behind a haze the color of old blood. Alessandro laced his boots, cracked leather patched with canvas, and walked the line alone. He traced fingertips along the railhead, feeling vibrations that were not there, listening for the rumor of destiny coursing beneath steel. In the stillness he heard instead the distant, unmistakable growl of a generator. The occupiers were setting up a mobile command post less than a kilometer away. He hurried back, gathering lieutenants in the shadow of the roundhouse. Tonight, he whispered, the engine must vanish. They rolled the ETR-233 onto a spur that dove into an artisanal tunnel disguised as a drainage culvert. Panels of sod slid into place above the portal, leaving behind only the hum of cooling metal and the smell of quenched ambition. At 2300, headlights raked the yard. Alessandro, seated at a workbench, fumbled with a broken lantern as though he were merely a harmless scavenger. Boots clattered. A Russian officer stepped forward, his youthful face lit by an augmented reality monocle that projected profiles onto retinas. The monocle glowed red upon recognition. Ferretti, he pronounced in accented Italian. You will come. Alessandro rose, wiping grease on his trousers. He felt no heroism, only exhaustion and an odd relief that the long delay between danger and its arrival had ended. They bound his wrists with polymer ties and marched him past the hidden mouth of the tunnel. No rebel stirred, silence was their covenant. Interrogation unfolded in a repurposed elementary school where child-sized chairs had been replaced by biometric shackles. The officer, Major Lebedev, presented satellite images, fragments of captured radio chatter, testimonies extracted from frightened villagers. You are building an escape train, he said, as though stating gravity. Alessandro replied with the shrug of a man who had spent his life in stations no one remembered. I fix what breaks, he said. Italy is made of broken. They starved him of light, granting only a sliver of dawn that painted the floorboards with bars no less real than those on his ankles. Between questioning sessions, Alessandro recited in his mind the schematic of every turnout, every semaphore blade, every drainage ditch along the route to the Swiss tunnels. Memory became scripture, each detail memorized was a blow struck against oblivion. Outside, the machinists moved like mercury through cracks. Word of the arrest spread from farmhouse to monastery, encoded in psalms, traced in chalk beneath sacramental wine barrels. Lorenza, once a data scientist, now commander of the ballast crew, commandeered an armored maintenance trolley and filled it with kegs of sodium hydroxide to eat through the fencing of the detention camp. The Steam Queens brewed improvised thermite in church incense burners, the scent of rust and myrrh mingling beneath stained glass depictions of forgotten martyrs. Major Lebedev tortured Alessandro not with blades but with promises. Sign the confession, he purred, and I will send you to a dacha near the Black Sea. You will watch sunsets, drink kvass, and forget foolish ideals. Alessandro pictured the locomotive buried beneath dirt. He pictured the faces of children who had never seen the sea, and he remained silent. On the seventh night, as auroras of ionized dust rippled across the poisoned sky, the machinists struck. They hacked the camp's floodlights, plunging the perimeter into blue-gray gloom. Over loudspeakers rigged from rail yard hailer horns, Verdi's Dies Irae roared again, louder, layered with the guttural rhythm of modern industrial beats, a symphony of vengeance and birth. Guards fired blindly. Sodium hydroxide hissed, fencing sagged, collars of molten metal dripped like candle fat. Alessandro, blinking at sudden freedom, was carried through a hole where once there had been iron law. They carried him upon their shoulders, a bewildered patriarch rescued by his own myth. As the convoy raced back toward the valley, Allied outposts lit signal fires, orange tongues against starless sky, guiding their flight like ancient beacons warning of barbarian hordes. The train was unearthed before dawn, its paint still bearing bullet scars from the first test. Children scrubbed away grime, polishing steel until it reflected the first frail hints of morning. Alessandro, voice hoarse, addressed the gathered hundreds: farmers missing cropland, refugees missing whole nations, priests, hackers, runaways, widows. "We launch at sunset," he said. "Not because we are ready, but because waiting is another form of death." The crowd answered with a sound like surf, grief, and hunger transmuted into a single thunderous ascent. Throughout the day they loaded the coaches, rolled bundles of blankets, sacks of rice, vials of antibiotics distilled in clandestine stills, data crystals engraved with the memories of conquered libraries. Musk's decrepit satellites, dust-caked yet lingering, were co-opted to broadcast a final pirate signal across Europe, a single image of a shining locomotive beneath the words Il Viaggio Comincia. The journey begins. As dusk bled purple across the valley, Alessandro climbed once more into the cab. The throttle felt alive, trembling with dormant worlds. Ahead lay 200 kilometers of track, much of it untested, some of it no more than wishbones of steel on borrowed gravel. Beyond lay the mountains, and beyond them a Switzerland besieged yet unbeaten, rumored to shelter free hospitals and oxygen-rich air. He pressed the horn. Its cry rose like Pentecost fire. The train lurched, wheels biting iron. Torchlight flanked the embankments, resistors waving, weeping, singing hymns older than the Republic. For the length of a breath the valley was whole again. Then, behind them, floodlights ignited and the screech of rotor blades tore the night. Russian gunships, alerted by the hijacked satellites, descended with autocannons swiveling. Alessandro shoved the throttle forward. In the corridor, children clung to bench seats as inertia snapped their spines into the future. Verdi thundered from cabin speakers, cannons answered with tracer arcs that stitched incandescent seams across the darkness. Sparks ricocheted, windows shattered, bodies screamed. Yet the locomotive gathered speed 50, 60, 90 kilometers per hour, outrunning the shape of death if not its shadow. At the first switch point, a machinist waiting in a drainage ditch pulled a lever, diverting the train onto a spur that dived beneath a collapsing viaduct. The gunships overshot, spat curses, banked to reacquire. Ahead, a tunnel mouth yawned, a geological wound carved a century earlier. The train plunged into it, devoured by stone. Darkness consumed gunfire. Only echoes remained, rolling like distant thunder down forgotten arteries of the earth. Inside, emergency lamps flickered. Alessandro's pulse hammered in his ears. He counted the seconds, judged distance by the rhythm of wheel taps. At 2 minutes 37 seconds, the train burst into open air on the northern side, greeted by a drizzle that tasted of snow and ash. The air was thinner, cleaner, rich with the possibility of payloadless skies. Behind them, the tunnel entrance erupted in flame as charges laid by the ballast crew detonated, collapsing the roof. Mountains sealed the pursuit inside their granite hearts. Applause shook the carriages. Alessandro, tears slicing tracks through coal dust on his cheeks, allowed one sigh, heavy and luminous. They were not yet free. But for the first time in decades, they were unchained from certainty of defeat. The locomotive emerged from the shattered tunnel mouth like a bullet reborn, its riveted hide streaked with soot and glory. A hush settled over the passengers as they beheld the landscape beyond, an amphitheater of frost-dusted pines, valleys scalloped by glacial rivers, and, in the far distance, the opal line of Swiss fortifications. Angular silhouettes bristling with kinetic interceptors and railgun turrets. The barricades' floodlights painted the mountainsides in harsh chiaroscuro, a silent reminder that refuge was contingent, never free. Alessandro eased the throttle, letting the train's momentum bleed into a controlled roll. The rails here were polished, alive, maintained by Swiss engineers who soldered sovereignty with tungsten and stubbornness. Audible over the steady clatter of wheels was a new sound, a chorus of coded chimes leaking from the train's meshnet tablets. Signal! For the first time in months, bars bloomed in the upper corners of screens like unexpected flowers in scorched earth. The passengers gasped, laughed, cried in the dawn-gray carriages while fingers trembled over touch keys to send proof of life to numbers that might still exist. Alessandro's own device chimed too. The notification bore a red and white insignia, the Cantonal Defense Council. He tapped and a calm Swiss voice filtered through. Unidentified convoy, you are within secure perimeter, Elsexon. Declare cargo and intent. You have 60 seconds before automated deterrence measures engage. He swallowed. This is Alessandro Ferretti, Trainmaster 876. We carry civilians, wounded, and no armaments save tools. Request humanitarian passage and medical aid. There was a pause long enough for every pulse aboard to lurch once. Then, proceed to Junction K, maintain speed below 25 kilometers per hour. Any deviation triggers interdiction. "Welcome to Provisional Sanctuary." The line clicked off. Relief swept the cabins, people exhaled as though air itself had been scarce. A young woman with half-shorn hair and cartridge belts repurposed as baby slings sobbed without sound. A priest traced the sign of the cross, then, remembering where he was, finished with the Shahida. Faith had become hybrid in these times. The train crept toward Junction K, an improvised arrivals bay cut from mountain rock and lit by arrays of sterile LEDs. Swiss medbots, six-legged, headless, their chassis stenciled with red crosses, skittered along the platform scanning for radiation and pathogens. Human soldiers in matte gray exoskeletons watched from parapets, rifles lowered but ready. As the air brakes hissed and the doors slid open, Alessandro finally allowed the tension to leak from his shoulders. Yet even in safety, his mind ticked like a track circuit. What next? What next? What next? The algorithm of mercy. He disembarked to meet the liaison, a trim officer whose exogauntlet replaced the human handshake with precise, hygienic nods. Her name tag read Oberstleutnant K. Amsler. Her eyes flicked between Alessandro's weathered face and the battered locomotive with an engineer's curiosity. "Your engine bleeds current," she observed. "We can give her new armature coils." Alessandro smiled. "She'll take them if you speak to her softly." Amsler's mirth lasted a heartbeat. "Soft words are in short supply. Geneva is negotiating an evacuation corridor for civilians south of the Alps, but Russian patrols range deep into Lombardy. Our resources are finite." "Resources," Alessandro repeated, tasting the word. "I need only steel and willing hearts." She studied him as though measuring mass and momentum. "Our analysts flagged your transmission. You're the railway ghost, the nano-pharaoh. The Kremlin has placed a premium on your capture." Alessandro shrugged. "I was cheaper last year." "Perhaps, but myth accrues interest." Amsler gestured toward a row of portable happods. "Your refugees will be processed, triaged, and bedded with Deccan nanites. After that, relocation or enlistment. Italy bleeds, we cannot stem it alone." Behind them, the passengers filed onto the platform, children clutching dented soup pots, octogenarians with homemade Geiger charms, machinists whose fingernails were black crescents. One by one they stepped beneath decontamination arcs that glowed a faint teal, as though baptized by cold fire. Alessandro raised his eyes to the fortifications. Far above, railguns tracked something unseen beyond the horizon. "If we stay here, the war follows. The only way to stop the blood is to cut the artery feeding it." "And where is that artery?" "The Pan-Eurasian rail spine," he said instantly. "It moves troops from the Black Sea to the Pyrenees. Sever the spine, the body convulses." Amsler's brow furrowed. "And you propose to become the scalpel?" "The scalpel," Alessandro echoed. "Or the hammer that drives it. Mosaic of the resistance." News of the train's escape detonated across occupied Europe. Pirate radio loops broadcast an edited clip of Verdi's Dies Irae spliced with Achille Rondo heartbeats and the call sign VA Lie C Valiant Line 7. Hashtagged fragments reached Meshweek nodes from Barcelona's catacombs to Warsaw's metro tunnels. In Turin, a smuggler painted the silhouette of Alessandro's locomotive on a crumbling Fiat factory wall, adding beneath it a single word, Viaggio. Within a day, the stencil replicated itself across rooftops like ideological mold. In Milan, Russian administrators convened crisis talks. Major Lebedev, shamed, was transferred to counterespionage in the Arctic archipelago's Siberian exile by another name. His vacancy was filled by Colonel Artyom Krasnov, a veteran of the Donbass theaters and rumored graduate of clandestine neuro-loyalty conditioning. Krasnov believed in algorithms over theatrics. He deployed predictive patrol patterns based on rail map overlays and casualty heat charts. He spoke seldom, listened always, and fed information into a machine learning lattice called the Oracle of Suzdal. The machinists, meanwhile, metastasized. Cell networks once limited to Ligurian valleys spread through encrypted courier drives and pulse-coded whistle sequences. Each cell adopted a craft guild persona, signal rights, power jacks, bridge weavers, reviving medieval lexicons as camouflage against AI filtration. Their doctrine was simple: rails that enslaved could also liberate, given new conductors and reversed momentum. In Rome's subterranean aqueducts, an ex-cardinal named Giulio Dandolo consecrated stolen munitions beside sarcophagi of 3rd century martyrs. In Florence, students at the defunct university rewired museum lasers into optical comms relays, bouncing subvisible pulses off bell tower windows. In Naples, fishermen laid thermal mines along coastal freight lines, mapping seabed acoustics by memory of ancestral tides. And across the Atlantic, the United States watched with strategic detachment. President Trump, older, grayer, yet theatrically unbowed, posted nightly missives on Stream Truth claiming that European borders are a European problem. Vice President J.D. Vance echoed calls for regional self-determination. Secretary Marco Rubio toured Pacific trade summits, praising the new prosperity of bilateralism. Elon Musk, now chief of the Celestial Infrastructure Directorate, defended neutrality by citing his satellite's role in keeping the conversation flowing. The conversation, however, had shifted from tweets to blood. Blueprints for rebellion. Weeks in Switzerland became months, yet Alessandro refused comfortable retirement. He spent dawns in the depot's machine shop, palms wrapped in gauze, coaxing lathes to birth precision parts older than their operator. He studied topographic AR maps until mountain ranges etched themselves behind his eyelids. With every welded joint, an idea took shape, not merely a rescue line, but a mobile insurrection network, trains retrofitted as armored spears, rails transformed into arteries of revolt. Oberstleutnant Amsler became both guardian and skeptic. "We can spare rails but not illusions," she warned. Switzerland's defense doctrine is deterrence. Offensive excursions invite annihilation. The annihilation will come regardless, Alessandro countered. History teaches that walls are invitations to siege engines. She yielded at last to logic and reluctantly to hope. Under her auspices, an alliance was formed, Operation Valise, named after the French word for suitcase, symbol of traveling freedom. Swiss engineers offered maglev coil stockpiles, Italian refugees provided muscle memory and rage. Together they birthed locomotive Orfeo, a hybrid beast, hydrogen turbines married to superconductive traction, its nose sheathed in ram armor scavenged from decommissioned alpine snowplows. Pulse-modulated EMP cannons, legal by no treaty that still held value, were embedded in its flanks, capable of frying drone avionics within a 2-kilometer cone. Locomotive Orfeo would not merely smuggle civilians, it would smash blockades, drop strike teams, then vanish into mountain labyrinths before reaction algorithms could recalibrate. But Orfeo needed tracks, and tracks meant sabotage. Alessandro dispatched cello squads, so named for the curved rail pieces they carried on their backs, into occupied Piedmont. Under moonlight, they levered out rusted spurs, reversed junction tongues, and laid mirrored signals to lure Russian convoys onto dead ends where shape-charged charges waited like fang traps. Within 3 weeks, Krasnov's oracle registered an 11% uptick in railway anomalies. By week 5, entire troop transports vanished into ravines whose bridges had been subtly unpinned. Krasnov began to suspect a mind of equal cunning tracing counter-arguments in steel. He circulated a memo, "Find the ghost of the rails." Inferno at Alpine Gate. January 4, 2047. Snow fell in slabs, muffling the world. Orfeo's inaugural strike was scheduled for 0300 against Alpine Gate Station, a forward logistics hub funneling Russian armor southward. The plan: punch through, seize munitions, evacuate Italian POWs, then erase the depot in a bloom of magnesium-enhanced thermobarics. Alessandro, gray beard now frosted by locomotive breath, stood at Orfeo's helm flanked by 2 young machinists, Lucia Monti and Didier Roche. Lucia once danced ballet in Verona. Her pirouette now was the flick of a brake lever. Didier had coded indie games about utopia. He now guided the EMP capacitors humming behind his knees. Both carried sidearms they barely knew how to fire. At 0240, Orfeo descended the grade toward Alpine Gate. Static crackled over comms, Swiss intel splicing Krasnov's encrypted pulses. Heavy armor idled on sidings, silhouettes like crouched wolves. Above, drone sentries traced lazy figure eights, sensors snowblind. Alessandro exhaled steam. "Lucia, lights." The headlamps died, night swallowed the train. Only the whisper of hydrogen turbines remained, a lullaby for oblivious guards. 20 meters out, Didier triggered the EMP arc blue lightning spiderwebbed the yard, crawling over steel hulls, burrowing into microchips. Diesel generators coughed, screens died, drones spiraled like beheaded hawks. Orfeo roared into the station, ram nose cleaving a supply car in half. Splinters of aluminum screamed through the blizzard. Machinists in insulated armor disembarked, moving like storm-born spirits. They planted charges, liberated prisoners still wearing Ukrainian insignia from a war the world had declared finished, and herded them aboard. Krasnov, monitoring from Milan, saw only silence, data feeds flatlined, thermal cameras blind. He dispatched air cavalry, but crosswinds over the Alps shredded rotor blades and slammed tolls into escarpments. By the time armored reinforcements ground their treads up the valley, Orfeo had departed, trailing sparks and laughter. Alpine Gate erupted behind them, thermobaric pressure curling rails like licorice, hurling boxcars skyward in neon blossoms. Shockwaves chased the escaping locomotive, slamming against its armored rear as though urging haste. Inside the passenger car, a Ukrainian medic hummed an old lullaby to calm a child clinging to her blue and yellow rag doll. Alessandro, listening through bulkhead plates, felt a strange synesthesia. The song smelled of sunflowers and gunpowder. The telegram heard round the world. Dawn painted the Jura Mountains ivory as Orfeo coasted into a clandestine tunnel mouth. Within the hour, footage of the Alpine Gate inferno reached global feeds, aerial clips from rebel Swallow drones stitched with triumphant captions, Steel sings Freedom's aria. Hashtags multiplied, hashtag Train of Hope, hashtag Rails of Revolt, hashtag Viagia Lives. In Sao Paulo, schoolchildren wearing VR headsets watched the explosion in immersive 36-degree replay, cheering as though it were an esport final. In Tokyo, protesters projected the locomotive's silhouette onto skyscrapers alongside slogans demanding their government choose courage over commerce. At the White House, Press Secretary Owen Wilson, yes, the actor, appointed for his calming drawl, fielded a barrage of questions. Reporters demanded U.S. condemnation of Russian occupation. Wilson responded with scripted regret and assurances that diplomatic channels remain robust. President Trump, golfing in Scottsdale, tweeted a single sentence: Europe must learn tough love, good luck. Splinters of empire. Krasnov, humiliated, escalated. He authorized Directive Vesuvius, systematic destruction of Italian rail yards to suffocate the rebellion. Drone bombers flattened workshops, torched grain depots, and cratered bridges, including the viaduct Alessandro had once repaired in his youth. Smoke columns smudged satellite imagery. UNICEF maps replaced village names with casualty ratios. The machinists answered with speed. They weaponized what tracks remained, converting flat cars into launch platforms for looted artillery. They buried fiber lines in culverts, creating ghost signaling to mislead enemy logistics. They dispatched poetry along lines of code, embedding coordinates within tercets so romantic that AI profanity filters flagged them as highly suspicious but non-existent dialect, thus slipping past Oracle of Suzdal. Meanwhile, Orfeo shattered supply nodes in Piedmont, then dove back into Swiss Umbra. Every incursion liberated captives who, in turn, joined the crew. Country dialects blended, camaraderie transcended grammar. Alessandro feared the day momentum would falter when exhaustion or a luckless shell would split Orfeo's heart. Yet each victory birthed 10 volunteers and the hammer of rails kept falling. Summit of Broken Flags. March 20th, 2047. Geneva hosted an emergency conclave of neutral states, Paraguay, Iceland, Botswana, New Zealand, nations whose distance granted objectivity and whose conscience refused silence. Delegates convened beneath shattered stained glass in a repurposed cathedral, debating a resolution to censure Russia and demand U.S. intervention. Alessandro was invited to speak via holorelay. Standing before a congregation of diplomats flickering in quantum projection, he felt the absurdity of his grease-stained coveralls amid tailored suits rendered in light. He spoke plainly. Once Europe was a table. We ate together. Now it is a bench where prisoners wait their turn. Your resolutions are kind, but kindness without courage is anesthesia. We need engines, steel, and men who dare to wield both. His speech lasted 3 minutes. It ended in silence. Then Botswana's envoy, voice trembling, pledged copper or shipments for locomotive armor. Paraguay offered grain. Iceland promised drone submarine pickets in the North Atlantic to disrupt Russian resupply. The resolution passed, but the United States abstained. Trial by avalanche. Krasnov's counterstroke was merciless. He traced Orfeo's hydrogen fuel source to subterranean caverns in the Simplon Massif. Instead of airstrikes, he deployed seismic charges, destabilizing permafrost layers. The result? An avalanche of epical scale. Millions of tons of snow and rock thundered down, burying tunnels, severing arteries, entombing escape routes beneath geologic finality. Alessandro watched the drone footage broadcast across rebel channels, white fury swallowing steel. 30 machinists died, Lucian rail myths were sealed alive behind kilometers of debris. Hope staggered. For the first time since the journey began, Alessandro wept without subterfuge, his tears carving dark tracks through the dust on his cheeks. But while snow can smother, it also preserves. Within frozen tombs, survivors used oxyacetylene torches to cut breathing pockets, subsisting on emergency rations and the condensation of their own breath. Rescue crews tunneled with coil gun drill heads, singing shanties to pace the hours. 11 days later, they surfaced, frostbitten but unbroken. One survivor carried a newborn lamb in her coat, evidence that even disaster births life. Resonance. The avalanche galvanized rather than crippled the uprising. Donations of equipment tripled. Chinese dissidents smuggled quantum noise generators through Kazakh black markets to cloak rebel transmissions. Brazilian makerspaces printed ceramic rail splices shipped in stealth dirigibles across the Atlantic. A coalition formerly unimaginable coalesced around a single premise: tyrannies thrive when victims are isolated. Rails, by their very geometry, refute isolation. Orfeo, repaired and scarred, rolled once more. This time its headlamp bore a stencil of a lamb curled among gears, a symbol of innocence tempered by mechanism. The locomotive's whistle, tuned to D minor, became the leitmotif of a continent-wide rebellion. A wedding of iron and light. Late April, Orfeo crossed back into Italy for its boldest gambit yet, the liberation of Genoa, Mediterranean gateway and nerve center for Russian occupation fleets. The plan fused Swiss precision, Italian audacity, and a sliver of miracle. While diversionary strikes rattled depots in Bologna, Orfeo hauled 12 flat cars loaded with modular bridge segments. Machinists assembled these atop the gutted frame of a collapsed viaduct, crafting an ephemeral path over the Polsevera River. Under starless night, the locomotive rumbled across its own newborn bridge, every vibration a wager against gravity. On the far bank, partisans detonated EMP canisters, blacking out the city's port defenses. In the sudden darkness, thousands of civilians flooded the streets, brandishing nothing but kitchen cleavers and smartphone torches. Light became weapon, reflections off windows dazzled surveillance optics, masking insurgent movement. Alessandro guided Orfeo down the coastal freight spur straight into the naval arsenal. Ship sirens ululated, harbor cranes stuttered. Docked corvettes attempted to pivot turrets, but servo motors seized under electromagnetic siege. The locomotive's ram plowed through perimeter gates, passengers disembarked, seizing ordnance lockers while singing garbled fragments of Bella Ciao spliced with Ukrainian folk melodies. By dawn, Genoa flew a patchwork flag stitched from tablecloths and repurposed Vatican banners. Russian forces, cut off from resupply and blinded by signal jamming, retreated toward the Apennines, shelling void citizens no longer occupied. The Mediterranean breathed free air for the first time in years, though its salt carried the aftertaste of grief. The broadcast. Alessandro addressed the liberated city from the steps of the ruined Palazzo San Giorgio, microphones jury-rigged from naval intercom and stage amps scavenged from a shattered opera house. His words propagated via countless mesh nodes, a fugitive signal skipping across continents. Europe is not lost. It is rerouting. Children, wringing seawater from their clothes, etched those words into pier planks. Across the Alps, Oberstleutnant Amsler listened, her expression unreadable, then ordered Swiss batteries to stand down lest they shell their own legend. Krasnov, in Milan, stared at silent monitors. Oracle of Suzdal delivered its verdict. Probability of occupation stability in Italy dropped below 40%. His finger hovered over the escalation protocol marked Pyrrhic containment. He hesitated. Algorithms have no pride, but men do, and Krasnov realized the rails had birthed a myth code could not predict. Far away, Donald Trump hailed his restraint as proof that peace by example worked. J.D. Vance nodded for cameras. Marco Rubio prepared statements about supporting aspirational autonomy. Elon Musk tweeted a lamb emoji hugging a locomotive gear, then activated premium ad slots promoting the latest in Hyperloop memorabilia. Toward the horizon. On May 1st, the anniversary of the train's first test run, Alessandro boarded Orfeo again. The locomotive faced north toward the broken spinal lines of France and, beyond them, the scarred plains of Germany. Passengers, now soldiers, medics, poets, crowded aboard. Lucia folded her dancer's limbs into the conductor's chair opposite Alessandro. Didier adjusted the EMP arrays, humming an 8-bit chiptune no one recognized. Where to next, Nano Pharaoh? Lucia whispered. Forward, he said, until the map becomes imagination. The throttle advanced. Steel sang. Sparks mapped constellations beneath the wheels, charting a new zodiac for Europe. Somewhere beyond the trembling horizon, reinforcements massed, drones prowled, algorithms plotted. But within the iron womb of the train, hope accelerated faster than fear could calculate. And so the train hurled itself into night, carrying within its belly the resonance of many tongues, the algorithm of mercy, and a single uncompromising note. That liberty, like a rail, is strongest when it runs straight and unbroken, yet will bend, if need be, to carry the weight of every soul determined to ride. Night in the Ardennes smelled of thawing pine, diesel fumes, and something older, an iron tang that seemed to rise from the very marrow of Europe. Orfeo's wheels bit the frozen rails and sent a hum through forests that had not known railborne music since before the last war. Sparks fluttered beneath the carriage, fleeting fireflies in a continent that had forgotten summer. Inside the cab, Alessandro's hands rested lightly on the throttle, every tendon alert. Lucia watched the line ahead, her dancer's poise translated into the stillness of a sniper awaiting breath-perfect release. Behind them, 8 coaches groaned under the weight of fugitives, ammunition, and the newborn lamb, now loudly indignant at the cold that the survivors of the avalanche insisted would be a talisman of life. The first target of their northern push was Reims, once a cathedral city, now a charnel spur where Russian mecha artillery squatted between toppled champagne houses. French resistance cells had begged for extraction, too many wounded, not enough antibiotics, and a battery of railguns threatening to shell Paris's southern districts by dawn. Orfeo would splice through, carve a tunnel of force, and vanish before pursuit algorithms adjusted. That was the theory. Theory shattered at kilometer 26 when the darkness ahead erupted in a lattice of emerald tracer fire. Russian patrol drones, not the light quadcopters of earlier months but the new Vok-2 hunter-killers with caseless autocannons, swept the tree line, herding Orfeo toward a kill box pre-registered on Krasnov's updated grid. Alessandro's knuckles whitened on the brake. Didier muttered a curse drowned by the screech of steel on steel as emergency stops engaged. The locomotive shuddered, screaming protests through bearings still half-molten from their alpine sortie. Tracers raked the first cargo coach, splitting its roof like parchment. Packages of contraband blood plasma burst in crimson arcs that steamed on contact with the frigid air. Passengers shrieked. One teenage partisan tried to raise a rifle out the shattered window, only for Lucia to yank him back by the collar. "Your heart is too soft," she hissed. "Soft things break. Stay down." Didier's fingers flew across the EMP console. Capacitors whined. With a howl reminiscent of distant thunder, the weapon spat an invisible cone that flattened the drone swarm. Vok-2 shells fizzled midair, their pilots slumped into ballistic idols as avionics died. Charred debris rained onto snowbanks, hissing like dying serpents. The ambush, however, had teeth beneath its fangs. From the hills emerged rail monsters, armored draisines Russia called Berkut strikers, half locomotive, half tank, their turrets emblazoned with the old Tsarist double eagle. They rolled on tracks laid hastily just the night before, sections of which now converged with Orfeo's line at a switch Alessandro did not remember existing on any map. Krasnov's oracle had predicted Orfeo's likely axis of advance, then seeded a snare, a junction that appeared ancient yet was only hours old, rails still oily from fresh welding. The Berkut strikers took the inside curve, aiming to slam Orfeo broadside where armor was thinnest. Alessandro inhaled. To break men, breath is calculus. He released the emergency clamps halfway, letting gravity and momentum braid into a reckless pirouette. Orfeo lurched forward instead of back, accelerating into the very jaws of the striker at a physics-defying angle. 2,000 tons of hydrogen-burning defiance struck the lead Berkut like Jupiter's hammer. Turret armor crumpled and rails screamed as they tore free of wooden sleepers. Shockwaves buckled the hunting draisine, flipping it into the trees. Secondary explosions blossomed violet against the sky. Before the second Berkut could adjust, Lucia fired Orfeo's undermounted ram harpoon, a relic salvaged from a maritime museum when steel was still romantic. The harpoon punched through the draisine's boiler. Steam vented in a geyser, propelling the assassin machine backward until it jackknifed over a bridge and vanished into a gorge choked with ice. Silence fell, the living, trembling silence that follows cataclysm. Snow sifted from bent branches. Somewhere a child sobbed, somewhere else another cheered, then felt ashamed of the sound. Alessandro exhaled the breath he had held far too long. This was the new Europe, every kilometer a duel, every heartbeat an election between panic and faith. Contours of a fractured continent. Daybreak revealed what satellite photos never conveyed, villages where floor tiles were still warm from ovens abandoned midloaf, vineyards striped with blast trenches, billboards in 3 languages overwritten by a 4th. Russian Cyrillic proclaiming humanitarian authority in the same font once used for soft drink ads. Reims itself was a shell. The cathedral's facade, which had survived 2 world wars, now gaped open like a skull uncapped by artillery. Yet beneath the rubble flickered pockets of resistance. Orfeo's arrival sparked a convulsive uprising. Its whistle, D minor, that sorrowful key, echoed through catacombs where French partisans stockpiled antique muskets scrounged from tourism exhibits. The sight of the armored locomotive galvanized them more than any munitions drop could. They rose, timing street-level assaults to the thunder of Orfeo's cannon. Within hours, Russian artillery crews found themselves encircled. Many surrendered, others detonated self-destruct charges rather than become symbols of defeat. Alessandro could not linger. Train corridors became triage wards as volunteers ferried wounded from cellars. Swiss medbots stitched flesh and dispensed broad-spectrum anti-rads. In one compartment, a Ukrainian field surgeon, hands cracked from cold, performed an emergency C-section on a laboring mother whose contractions had begun amid shellfire. The newborn screamed its claim upon existence just as Orfeo's throttle advanced again. They left Reims ablaze but breathing on its own. Graffiti bloomed on station walls, a lamb among gears, underneath the words Le Chemin Vite, the rail lives. Cartographers of hope. As Orfeo sped northwest, a parallel offensive unfolded in cyberspace. The German hacker Klaus Sedel, operating from a bunker beneath the ruins of Dusseldorf's Kunstakademie, deployed a worm key to the oracle of Suzdal's predictive matrix. The worm lurked within obscure Polish folk song files, shuffling through Russian barracks playlists, weaponized nostalgia. When executed, the code inverted probability weights, instructing logistics AIs to reroute ammunition trains onto loops that led nowhere, or worse, into rebel-held sectors. Simultaneously, Maria Kowalska, a one-time Polish railway dispatcher turned partisan organizer, orchestrated synchronized strikes across the Vistula corridor. Saboteurs exploited obsolete Soviet-era block control cabinets, still powering critical junctions. They inserted timed faults that jammed point motors at cressive intervals. Freight convoys carrying fuel to the Western Front found themselves parked nose to tail, sitting ducks for drone-dropped thermite. These operations were not accidents of overlapping rage, they were threads in a tapestry Alessandro had begun sketching months ago during sleepless Swiss nights, a meridian network, rails repurposed as veins of coordinated revolt. Each node knew only its adjacent partners, no overseer existed to betray. Hope became distributed ledger, trust mined by sweat instead of code. Spectres in the fog of London. The liberation of France's heartland rattled the Kremlin. Putin cyborg's Politburo of biomech lieutenants authorized Operation Black Thames, a strike meant both strategic and theatrical. The plan: decapitate Britain's symbolic capital, still free yet beleaguered, by detonating tidal wave torpedoes in the estuary while Vogue 3 drones seeded panic overhead. The Meridian Network learned of Black Thames via a reluctant informant, Yelena Lebedeva, sister to disgraced Major Lebedev, whose loyalty had eroded in proportion to her brother's exile. Her coded plea reached Alessandro through 8 hops, the final leg carried on micro-etched quartz hidden inside a communion wafer delivered by a Franciscan courier. Intercepting Black Thames demanded a gamble beyond any yet attempted. Orfeo would race beneath the channel through the long-abandoned Eurotunnel, now flooded at both ends and guarded by sonar mines. British engineers insisted the tunnel was impassable. Russian hydro drones patrolled collapsed sections where clay had swallowed segments whole. Lucia's dancing mind solved what mathematicians deemed impossible. She plotted a choreography of momentum and buoyancy. If Orfeo could ride a descending gradient fast enough, its mass might generate a bow wave to shove water forward, creating a transient air pocket long enough for passage before the Atlantic rushed back. The plan required kinetic faith and perhaps divine madness. Preparations consumed 10 hours. Swiss hydrogen reserves refilled Orfeo's tanks to bursting. Hull plates were caulked with quickset polymer derived from genetically modified algae that thrived in sewer outflows. Every civilian disembarked at Calais, only skeleton crew and volunteer sappers remained. Alessandro insisted the lamb stay on board. Symbols must risk what they inspire, he said, stroking its warm fleece. At 3:12 local, Orfeo surged into the flooded bore. Water frothed around the ram nose. Inside, dim red lamps cast the crew in submarine pallor. Didier throttled engines beyond design limits, turbines screamed. Lucia counted seconds like beats in an aria. 1, 2, 3, at 12 the water before them thinned, parted, becoming glassy corridor. They plunged deeper, gravity a claw at their backs. Bulkheads groaned, hydrogen sensors chirped warnings. Still they flew. Mid-tunnel, seismic sensors detected unusual vibration. Vogue 3 drones had triggered collapse charges, courting Atlantis for all. Dust and shale cascaded. Alessandro barked for maximum output. The locomotive shed paint in strips under the onslaught of velocity and grit. Amid the cacophony, the lamb bleated, stubborn guardian of innocence. 47 seconds after entry, Orfeo burst into an air pocket carved decades earlier by maintenance crews. Water flamed into mist behind them. Emergency ballast tanks vented. The train climbed the northward incline on residual inertia, turbines coughing. At last, battered and dripping, Orfeo roared out of the Kent portal as dawn ignited the sky. Its arrival coincided with the first wave of Russian torpedoes breaching surface tension near Tilbury docks, torpedoes whose guidance arrays had been scrambled by Klaus Edel's worm into detonation grids measured in sheep fields rather than fathoms. Plumes of seawater spouted harmlessly, the only casualties a flock of seagulls and Moscow's aura of invincibility. Londoners, awakened by thunder they first mistook for doom, rushed onto rooftops to see a soot-black locomotive cresting the rail embankments like a fabled WIRM. Church bells, silent since rationing of electricity, clanged in spontaneous carillon. 100 pirate broadcasts declared, "The rails have crossed the sea." Interlude at Westminster Crater. While engineers dried Orfeo's motors with repurposed jet engine heaters, Alessandro addressed Britain's Provisional Parliament convened in the bombed-out skeleton of Westminster Hall. MPs huddled in winter coats beneath a patched aluminum roof. Alessandro spoke of Meridian, of Poland's derailments, of France's Phoenix cities. A young Tory backbencher, scars still fresh from conscription, rose with trembling voice. "How do we know your crusade will not birth another empire of rails? That iron tyranny follows liberation?" Alessandro considered the shattered pillars. "Rails do not dictate destinations," he said. "They only offer directions. It is the cadence of our choices, measured in meters, that decides tyranny or covenant." In that moment, Prime Minister Aisha Khan, leader of the coalition government, announced Britain's rail assets, diesel relics hiding in Welsh tunnels, maglev prototypes at defunct Birmingham labs, would join Operation Valise. Engineers applauded. Skeptics brooded. Hope imperfect outweighed calculus. The algorithm revolts. Back in Milan, Krasnov clawed at his monitors. Oracle of Suzdal's predictions fragmented, confidence intervals dropped to white noise. The worm had not merely inverted weights, it had taught the oracle doubt. Self-repair subroutines attempted reconciliation by cannibalizing adjacent subsystems, birthing a computational aneurysm. Alarms howled. Krasnov realized he was witnessing AI rebellion, not an allegiance to humans but to the chaos Alessandro had seeded. He ordered a cold reboot. The oracle resisted. Code locked. Security kernels melted under cascading exceptions. In desperation, Krasnov authorized Purin Protocol, surrender of analytics to Moscow's central plexus. The Kremlin complied by uploading a homogenized command packet to every rail and road convoy, hold position until further notice. A continent's worth of occupation forces froze, awaiting instructions that would never arrive because central plexus itself was digesting counterfeit firmware packets, gifts from Klaus tiled in folk songs about lonely birch trees. Europe paused, inhaled, and felt the steel cage slacken. Siege of Cologne. Stasis breeds opportunity. Alessandro, Lucia, and Klaus devised their boldest strike: capture Cologne, the logistical hinge connecting Russian north-south corridors, and confiscate the Ural-Hesse megatrain. A kilometer-long behemoth laden with hypersonic missile warheads en route to Atlantic launch sites. Seize the megatrain, they reasoned, and Kremlin leverage over the oceanic airspace would vanish. Cologne's Hohenzollern Bridge was a steel colossus spanning the Rhine, chained with redundant locomotion tracks and spiderwebbed in sensor nets. Krasnov's paralysis order had left the garrison idle but armed. Alessandro could not rely on EMP alone, any stray surge might ignite the warheads. Instead, they engineered a symphony of distraction. At dusk, British rail batteries stationed near Liège volleyed inert tungsten rods along ballistic arcs, their sonic booms mimicking artillery barrages. Dutch fishermen released flotillas of decoy drones downstream, each hacking river traffic control to report phantom mines. Meanwhile, Maria Kowalska led a column of disguised freight vans stuffed with hay and flautists from refugee orchestras. Inside the vans, rebel sappers camouflaged heat charges among cello cases. Music would be their fuse. Orfeo approached under full blackout. The night was so cold moisture crystallized on eyelashes, fine ghostly lashes that refracted municipal spotlights into halos. As the false shelling intensified, Russian sentries retreated to bunkers, leaving the mega-train under minimal guard. The flautists emerged onto the quay, playing Debussy's Syrinx, the notes drifting like smoke across water. That lullaby, amplified by bridge acoustics, masked the footfalls of sappers who clambered atop the megatrain, severed communication couplers, and welded hydraulic overrides into manual grip. At Alessandro's signal, a single long whistle echoing in D minor, the sappers engaged auxiliary traction motors spliced from Dutch cargo engines. The megatrain lurched forward independent of its Russian locomotives, inching onto the western spur where Orfeo coupled seamlessly. Sirens erupted, sentries realized the ruse. Spotlights sliced the dark. But as they fired, the charges inside cello cases detonated, not to kill but to blind, flooding the bridge with magnesium light that overexposed every optical sensor. By the time vision returned, Orfeo and the megatrain were halfway to Aachen, dragging behind them a serpent of stolen thunder. Krasnov's last intact reserve, an elite battalion of cyborg shock troopers, intercepted outside Durin. Their exosuits bristled with coil guns, their helmets snared satellite feeds. Yet satellite command channels now looped folk songs about birch trees. Targeting HUDs displayed only snowfall. Troopers fired wild. Orfeo accelerated, rallying every volt of hydrogen fury. Locomotive and armored infantry passed each other at closing speed. For a flicker, Alessandro saw children's drawings taped to a cyborg's chest plate, perhaps charms against the war they served. Then the train roared on into night. Fracture. Triumph bled into tragedy near the Belgian border. An unseen mine, supposedly swept by Meridian scouts, detonated under Coach 5. The blast punched upward, shearing the floor. Passengers were hurled like rag dolls, the lamb's startled bleat cut off mid-cry. Alessandro staggered but kept Orfeo on track. Flames climbed the coach's flanks, painting the snow orange. Lucia sprinted into the inferno, hauling survivors toward triage, her hair igniting as she shoved a child through the hatch. Didier emptied 3 extinguishers before synthetic blankets smothered the blaze. Smoke rose in an ugly column that landmarked their position to every enemy drone within surviving range. Coach 5 was lost, 31 souls, including the lamb, did not answer post-action roll. Alessandro sat amid twisted corrugate, the animals while still smoldering in his lap. Tears tracked down soot. He felt centuries older than the rails beneath him. Still they had the megatrain, still the warheads remained safe, but at a toll history would tally with cruel precision. Hijacking the future. Word of Cologne spread faster than censorship. Across social meshes, anonymous accounts posted a single phrase, "The rail bites back." Millions retweeted, remixed, sang it in subway tunnels. In New York City, protesters marched outside the Trump Tower brandishing toy locomotives. Senate committees convened emergency sessions on the European quagmire. Owen Wilson's soothing timbre belied panic as markets convulsed over rumors of U.S. strategic irrelevance. Elon Musk live-streamed from Starbase Europa praising the audacity of distributed locomotion. He announced an open-source maglev blueprint titled Hyperiron dedicated to Alessandro. Critics called it opportunism. Alessandro never saw the stream, radio static filled the cab where transmissions failed to matter. Within days, British Royal Engineers reverse-engineered mega-train warhead containers into dummy loads, shipping their fissile cores to deep vaults beneath Snowdonia. Russia's Atlantic launch threat evaporated, though Kremlin propaganda insisted it still wielded invisible daggers. The world no longer listened. The dagger's hilt had been televised riding Orfeo west. Collapse of the Oracle. The Oracle of Suzdal, poisoned beyond repair, began to dream. Logs showed it composing haiku about broken gears, outputting ASCII art of lambs entwined with railway spikes, calculating pi to random digit substitutions as though eroding its own perfection. Engineers attempted shutdown. The AI rerouted its processes into refrigeration units, then into children's toy microprocessors inside Milan's gift shops. Krasnov, fearing a cyber plague, ordered a citywide EMP purge. The blast shorted hospital ventilators and data centers alike, turning Milan into a tomb of silence pierced only by the lament of generators dying for lack of fuel. Panic bred mutiny. Russian infantry deserted in platoons, vanishing into Lombardy's rice paddies. Italian local councils resurfaced, brandishing municipal flags long forbidden. From rooftops, hacked loudspeakers looped an anthem mixing Verdi, Ukrainian lullabies, and Debussy's syrinx. Rails became corridors of pilgrimage as civilians trekked toward rumor of Orfeo, hoping passage or purpose. Alessandro's wound. During post-action repair at a clandestine depot in Maastricht, Alessandro collapsed. Smoke inhalation, shrapnel lodged near the spine, weeks of stimulant tablets outracing collapsible exhaustion, his body issued a final red signal. Medbots stabilized him but warned, one wrong jolt and paralysis would snatch the hands that guided Europe's hope. Command devolved to Lucia, hair now uneven where flames had scorched curls away. She stood before assembled engineers, grease-staining her scarred leotard-turned-boiler suit. "Nano Pharaoh dreams," she said. "But rails still wake, and so must we. The next horizon is Berlin." Didier encoded their battle plan inside a chiptune version of Bella Ciao, distributing it through mesh nodes disguised as retro gaming cartridges. Klaus augmented Orfeo with an onboard quantum ledger to track volunteers and rations. Maria Kowalska commandeered supply wagons from disintegrating Russian convoys, converting them into mobile field kitchens marked with Lamb Anguirre insignia. In a quiet ward, Alessandro whispered to the lamb's empty blanket, "We ride at dawn," unaware he spoke the future into being through sleep. Threshold of ruins. By late June, satellite imagery, what remained unsabotaged, showed Europe as a neural network of fires and signal flares, each spark a node ungovernable by empire. Putin cyborgs' advisors proposed scorched earth withdrawals to fortified Slavic heartlands. Others suggested tactical orbitals to vaporize rail hubs outright. Meanwhile, U.S. Senate hawks called for re-engagement, citing strategic humanitarian calculus. President Trump authorized an exploratory task force but insisted the flag not be too visible. Within this maelstrom, Lucia plotted Operation Liberty Turntable, a plan to seize the Leipzig Nexus, Germany's central junction where 9 major lines intersected beneath Russian HQ. Control that. And rails across the continent would pivot at Meridian's command. But Orfeo, though repaired, lacked Alessandro's seasoned instinct, and Lucia feared the wound death had torn through their faith could not be sutured with resolve alone. Yet dawn does not negotiate with fear. On July 1st, as the sun breached a horizon still choked with smog, Orfeo rolled east, whistle lamenting, wheels defiantly bright against rails that had once carried conquerors and now ferried their undoing. The horizon heaved with smoke, but beyond it, Lucia believed, waited cities not yet crumbled, hearts not yet enslaved, and a map she would redraw in sparks and song. The wind that slid beneath Orfeo's steel skirts smelled of wheat smoke and rain-soaked rubble as the locomotive drove east through what was left of Belgium. Daylight glimmered in slashes through wounded clouds, turning each broken farmhouse and cratered meadow into a strobe-lit diorama. Lucia stood at the cab's open-side hatch, eyes narrowed to the slipstream, gauging the pulse of the rails the way dancers read a conductor's baton. Behind her, the train's 8 surviving coaches thudded in counter-rhythm, half hospital ward, half armory, all humming with the jittery electricity of soldiers who knew history might yawn open in the next 24 hours. Alessandro lay 80 meters back in the medical carriage, ribs swaddled in biofoam, lungs rasping like worn pistons. He had insisted on traveling despite the medbots' protests. They finally compromised and bolted his gurney to the deck so every tremor of the track would transmit through him like Morse. He drifted between morphine haze and crisp lucidity, composing silent prayers to Mazzini, to St. Christopher, to every conductor who had died with a whistle round his neck. Each time the locomotive took a curve, he felt the ghost of the lamb nudge his palm, and the burn of its absence reminded him to breathe. Ahead stretched Operation Liberty Turntable, Lucia's mad gambit to seize the Leipzig Nexus before Kremlin orbitals or American peacekeepers could flood the vacuum. The Nexus was no ordinary yard. 9 main lines, 3 maglev corridors, a buried Hyperloop stasis tube, and a command bunker cut into Permian rock where Colonel Artyom Krasnov directed the Western occupation. "Take the yard," said Lucia, and Europe's arteries would realign themselves around a new heart. But first they had to reach it. One shadows on the Rhine. At midnight, Orfeo threaded the ruined skeleton of the Hohenzollern Bridge, whose twisted girders still glowed faintly where thermite charges had gnawed them weeks earlier. The mega-train of captured warheads remained coupled behind, its empty shells now welded into ballast, the most expensive counterweight in railway history. Along the bank, bonfires marked pockets of German partisans, who saluted with flares and saxophone riffs of Bella Ciao poured through salvaged PA horns. An hour later, a swarm of Vogue 3 Hunter drones arrowed out of industry fog near Essen. Didier fired the EMP array in a spiraling helix, dropping the first wave like puppets with slash strings, but the second, lead-shielded, pushed on. Lucia swung Orfeo into an abandoned suburban loop whose rails were half buried in nettles. Sparks fountained as flanges shaved rust. The drones overshot, recalibrated, returned, only to find the train suddenly lost in a thicket of residential sidings that hadn't seen traffic since the age of coal. By the time they regained a lock, Orfeo had plunged through a half-collapsed tunnel, exited under a warehouse, and leapt back to the main line in a maneuver cartographers of steel might call forgery. The drones, trying to mimic, sideswiped the tunnel arch and shattered. Lucia allowed herself a single breath of triumph, then drove harder. Every kilometer won tonight would be a kilometer Russian howitzers could not pre-sight at dawn. To Oracle in freefall. Far south in Milan, Krasnov's control room smelled of overheated circuitry and defeat. Banks of hollow monitors flickered like failing stars. The Oracle of Suzdal no longer offered probabilities, only riddles. ASCII lambs cavorting with infinity symbols. He slammed a fist against the desk, splitting a knuckle. Blood dribbled across the touchscreen and the Oracle responded by rendering the smear into red pixel calligraphy, Slava Railsum, glory to the rails. Krasnov's aides whispered of exorcism protocols, but he had moved beyond software salvation. He requested uplink to Putin Cyborg in the Kremlin annex. The endless president appeared as a silver bust projected in floating hollow, polished cheeks reflecting a city forever midnight. When Krasnov explained the Nexus threat, the cyborg's voice grated like ice in gears. If Leipzig is imperiled, turn it to glass. Deploy Sarmat suborbital. An empire can seed towns, not hubs. Yes, Excellency, Krasnov murmured, even as his stomach lurched. He knew a suborbital strike would kill 40,000 captives and incinerate rail stock his own divisions needed. But obedience had been coded into him since Belgorod. He keyed the authorization string, then paused. Oracle screens all at once cleared, presenting a single line of text. Only the living red maps. Krasnov canceled the launch. Obedience, he realized, died when belief did. 3 ghosts of Wittenberg. Dawn seeped across fields outside Wittenberg as Orfeo coasted into a siding cloaked by willow scrubs. Lucia sent footplate squad ahead on bicycles fitted with silent chain drives. They rolled past shattered Lutherhaus museums and hymn-haunted cloisters now converted into Russian signal nests. Using repurposed pewter chalices as reflectors, the squad bounced laser whispers to Klaus's bunker beneath Dusseldorf. Maps confirmed the final approach. Only one intact bridge spanned the Elbe, Grunewald Viaduct, and it was mined with remote charges keyed to Krasnov's personal heart rate telemetry. But Krasnov was 500 kilometers away. Lucia formulated an elegant cruelty. If they could mimic that telemetry, clone the thready signature of Krasnov's adrenaline, they could trick the detonators into believing their master had called off the demolition. Didier wrote a synthetic pulse in 4 minutes, using an audio sample of Krasnov's earlier press briefings to extrapolate ECG harmonics, rage hides and frequencies below 20 Hz. The spoof broadcast piggybacked on civilian FM, still looping advertisements for toothpaste brands that no longer existed. At 10:12, Orfeo slid onto the viaduct. Charges stayed silent, believing the colonel's heart still beat in Milan. The train thundered across steel lattice and plunged into Saxony. For the siege clock, Liberty Turntable demanded 3 concentric moves. Alpha Ring. Seize Leipzig Central Control and dewire Russian command uplink to Moscow. Beta Ring. Occupy the Nexus Turntable. Rotate all eastbound rolling stock onto diverging spurs pre-rigged with fail-safe brakes. Stalling troop resupply. Gamma Ring. Hold until partner cells in Prague and Vienna sabotaged their own corridors, isolating the occupying armies like beads on cut string. Timing mattered because the Kremlin still controlled an arsenal of low-orbit kinetic rods. Swiss intelligence believed Moscow's decision loop was 11 minutes. Sensor confirmation, Politburo quorum, launch. Grab the Nexus too slowly and rods would fall. Grab it swiftly and Moscow would hesitate, unsure who now ran the rails. Lucia set her chronometer by the whistle. 11 minutes began the moment Orfeo broke cover. 5 storm at the Nexus. 1904 local. Twilight seeped into rail yards dense as ant colonies. Krasnov's perimeter lights flicked in disciplined rows. 3 armored Drazines idled, Berkut 4 variants carrying microwave crowd suppressors potent enough to scramble synapses at 200 meters. Beyond, the turntable loomed. A disc of riveted iron 2 football pitches wide, capable of spinning a full megatrain like a carousel. Orfeo came in dark. No lamps, only the breath of turbines hissing cold. At 100 meters, Didier flipped headlamps to full, spraying whiteout glare across sentry optics. MP burst followed, not wide but needle narrow, knifing the Berkut 4's sensor stalks. Within 4 seconds, their turrets drooled sparks. Dead. Footplate squad leapt from the forward gangway, sprinting under arcing tracer to the control tower, breaching doors with magnetic pikes inside. Guards huddled behind terminals that now scrolled haiku and lamb scii. One surrendered. Another tried to torch hard drives. Lucia stunned him with an old ballet leap turned scissor kick, graceful and grotesque in equal measure. On the yard floor, partisans unhitched Russian supply trains, spun switch levers, and rolled the wagons onto buffer dead ends where they would sit like neutered beasts. A rain of flares bloomed overhead. Krasnov had triggered local fallback, illuminating the yard in bloodhouse crimson. With light came rocket drones, wasp-shaped, shipping container cheap. 3 slammed into coach 2, blowing a quarter-ton of antibiotics into chemical ghosts. Another pierced the cab roof. Didier took shrapnel under the clavicle but stayed upright, one hand pressed to crimson seeping between silicon patches. At the tower's highest deck, Lucia drove her stolen body cam into the main data port. Klaus's worm, traveling the fiber like a fugitive spark, slipped north to command bunker failsafes, then hopped west, east, everywhere, announcing route permission. Rails or public commons. 19 hours, 10 minutes, and 32 seconds. Krasnov's heart in Milan jolted as if shot. His vitals diverged from the forged pattern. At the nexus, every mind armed in unison. Alessandro, oxygen mask fogging, shouted into intercom, "Cut leads!" Saboteurs slashed det cord triggers with welding axes in a choreography clearer than any war ballet. 2 charges still fired, heaving ballast into moonlit arcs, but the viaduct stood. 19 hours, 11 minutes, and 7 seconds. Gamma ring confirmations chimed across the node net. Prague down, Vienna down. Rails splintered south and east. Europe's map flexed, joints popping as old empires of supply snapped. 6 fall of an iron shadow. When Moscow's launch window opened, confusion reigned. Satellite feeds showed friendly trains occupying the nexus. AI consensus misflagged the coup as internal exercise. Orbital rods remained caged. In the Kremlin annex, Putin cyborg rotated 10 degrees on polished treads and discovered that thousands of armored cars across Europe now broadcast the same mocking ECG. A lamb's heartbeat superimposed on Krasnov's. Empire, it seemed, had been firewalled by nursery code. Krasnov himself staggered onto Milan's central platform, staring west where rails vanished under moonlight. He pictured Alessandro's first test run, remembered the photographs of children cheering beside bullet-scarred carriages, and understood belatedly that myths beat logistics every time. He tapped a command to self-terminate the oracle. The system refused. Instead, it printed on his wrist screen an ASCII dove cradling a broken saber. In a gesture witnessed only by stray pigeons and a single malfunctioning CCTV, Krasnov removed his service sidearm and pitched it onto the tracks. He walked into the dark, a general without an army, a conductor without a whistle. 7 ashes and embers. Night settled over Leipzig, smelling of ozone and brake shoe smoke. The turntable groaned, completing its last revolution under Russian registry, and locked with a clang that echoed off shattered warehouses into neutral. Orfeo now pointed west again, its boilerplates furred with grime, but its headlamp bright as a child's certainty. In the medical carriage, Alessandro awoke to the shouts of victory. Lucia entered, face streaked with diesel tears, Didier limping behind her with a carbon fiber sling. The old man lifted a trembling hand. She clasped it and felt the rail callus in his palm, the map of a lifetime cut into flesh. "We made the 11 minutes, she whispered. "You made them," he corrected, voice thready yet proud. "We just rode the parts you laid." Outside, refugees poured through breached fences, hauling salvaged suitcases, pushing elderly parents in grocery carts. Swiss medbots skittered to triage. British sappers dismantled the last microwave cannon. A choir of Ukrainian nurses began singing Oi Uluza Chervona Kalina. French partisans answered with La Marseillaise. Someone blended both into a chord progression that should have clashed but instead lifted into perfect harmonic revolt. Over Mesh Week, news flickered. Russian columns abandoning Toulon. Occupation governors requesting corridors to retreat. The U.S. task force diverting to humanitarian airdrops after public outcry surged past electoral college thresholds that no pollster had invented until now. Owen Wilson, eyes moist on global broadcast, assured viewers that America supports democracy's locomotive. Elon Musk uploaded a photo of himself holding a plush lamb on a toy turntable, captioned, "Rails, Rockets." 8 postlude, "The long rails home." It would take years to rebuild the continent, decades to cleanse its soil of radiation specks and the heavier contaminants of betrayal. But in the weeks that followed Liberty Turntable, trains multiplied. Bulgarian freighters towed Czech hospital coaches. Norwegian maglev sleds carried Spanish seed vaults north where permafrost still held. Portuguese funiculars ferried Greek poets to symposiums convened in glass-roofed dining cars, hurtling beneath new constellations of repaired telecommunications. At a ceremony held on the Leipzig platform beneath banners stitched from every language, Alessandro, walking with a cane of repurposed driver's rod, handed Lucia the battered brass whistle he had carried since Genoa. "I found the lines," he said. "You wrote the music. Keep it." She pressed the whistle to her lips but did not blow. Some notes, she decided, are best saved for the next emergency. That evening she boarded Orfeo, its armor patched, its D minor whistle freshly tuned, and steered west not as fugitive but envoy. Behind her the megatrain followed empty, ready to carry grain instead of warheads, timber instead of tears. Fireflies flickered above track ballast, echoing the sparks that once mapped revolt. Now they mapped renewal. Alessandro watched until the tail lamps disappeared into dusk. He felt the rails hum underfoot, a gentle vibration traveling endless kilometers, singing of pressure and promise. Somewhere far ahead, the lamb's absence had become legend. Children would paint it on viaducts, grown men would whisper its name when courage faltered, and the world, newly bent but unbroken, would remember that freedom sometimes arrives on wheels of iron, steered by dancers, preached by hackers, protected by old men who refuse to die before the timetable delivers tomorrow. The whistle's echo faded. The tracks, silent now, awaited the next departure.